Under the blazing sun, a faint cry broke the stillness of the savannah, pulling attention to its source. Cautiously, an elderly woman made her way toward the sound, weaving through the tall grass. Each step quickened her heartbeat. When the grass finally parted, she discovered a small, trembling creature. Its fur was as white as fresh snow, and its eyes brimmed with fear. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The old woman knelt down, slowly extending her hand, the air thick with anticipation. What had started as an ordinary walk was about to become extraordinary. The setting sun bathed the vast savannah in golden hues, casting long shadows on the cracked, parched earth. In the distance, towering baobab trees stood resolute, their gnarled branches reaching skyward like silent guardians. On the edge of this barren land stood a modest hut made of mud and straw. The hut leaned slightly, as though weary from years of enduring the scorching sun and relentless wind. This humble home belonged to Mama Grace, a widow who had lived in solitude for many years. Mama Grace stepped out of her hut, her back slightly stooped from a life of toil. She wore a simple shawl draped over her shoulders and carried a woven basket in her weathered, calloused hands. Her eyes, lined with the marks of hardship, gazed across the horizon with quiet resolve. The nearby village of Willow was lively and bustling, a stark contrast to Mama Grace's tranquil existence. She seldom visited the village, having retreated into solitude after losing her family to a devastating drought many years ago. Barefoot, Mama Grace walked slowly across the uneven terrain, occasionally pausing to pick up dry branches and twigs to fill her basket. The only sounds were the distant cries of birds and the gentle rustling of grass in the window, reminder that life, though sparse, still thrived in the wilderness. Despite her lonely, arduous life, Mama Grace remained resilient. For a moment, she stood upright, shifting the basket on her hip, and cast a glance back at her little huta, simple yet serene place she called home. The morning sun hung low in the sky, painting the quiet savannah in a soft golden glow. Mama Grace moved at a steady pace through the open land, her basket already half filled with twigs and dried branches. She paused briefly to rest, wiping the sweat from her brow with the corner of her shawl. That's when she heard it. At first, it was faint, barely audible over the soft breeze. She stopped in her tracks, tilting her head to listen. Then it came again, a weak, trembling cry, like that of an infant in distress. Her heart began to pound as she scanned the grass and scattered trees, gripping her walking stick tightly. Mama Grace followed the sound, stepping carefully over the dry, crackling ground. The cries grew louder, pulling her deeper into the wilderness. She pushed aside a patch of tall grass and froze in place. Lying on the ground was a small, trembling creature. Its fur was as white as freshly fallen snow, standing out vividly against the earthy browns and greens of the savannah. The tiny animal shook, and Mama Grace's breath caught it was a baby albino baboon. Its wide, frightened eyes glistened with tears as it let out another soft, helpless cry. Its tiny hands reached out into the air, grasping for something, for someone. Mama Grace's heart melted. She knelt down slowly, careful not to alarm the little creature. "Oh, poor little one," she murmured, her voice soft and kind, like a mother speaking to a frightened child. "Why are you all alone out here?" The baby baboon flinched and shrank back into the grass, its small body taut with fear. Mama Grace remained still, moving only as softly as the breeze. She extended her hand, palm open, showing she meant no harm. "It's okay," she whispered in a soothing tone. After a moment, the baboon's trembling eased slightly. Its curious eyes studied Mama Grace's face, as if searching for safety. Then, with a cautious motion, its tiny, shaking hand reached out and touched her fingers. A warm smile spread across Mama Grace's face. Gently, She scooped up the delicate creature, cradling it carefully in her arms. It was so light, its fragile body barely noticeable. Its soft, silky fur felt like a miracle against her calloused hands. She held the baboon close, rocking it tenderly as though it were a baby needing comfort. "You are safe now," she whispered. The baby baboon nestled against her chest, its cries fading into quiet, exhausted whimpers. For the first time in years, Mama Grace felt a warmth bloom inside her, a feeling she had long forgotten. Balancing her basket on one hip and holding the tiny baboon securely in her arms, Mama Grace began the journey back to her hut. As she walked, she spoke softly to the little one, her voice filled with hope and affection. "I'll call you Jamie," she said gently. "You'll be my little hope." As time passed, the fragile baby baboon Mama Grace had rescued grew into a spirited companion. At first, Jamie was shy, clinging to Mama Grace's shawl or sitting quietly by her side while she wove baskets. But as days turned into weeks, Jamie grew bolder. His curious eyes began exploring every corner of the hut, and before long, he followed Mama Grace wherever she went. One cool morning, as Mama Grace headed out to gather firewood, Jamie bounded after her with lively enthusiasm. His white fur gleamed brilliantly in the morning sun. He mimicked her every move, picking up small sticks and carefully placing them into her basket. Mama Grace laughed, her voice echoing across the quiet savannah. "You are such a clever little helper," she said, smiling as she gently patted Jamie's soft head. Jamie chirped happily and darted off to find more twigs. As months turned into years, Jamie grew big and strong. His slender arms became muscular and his small body grew tall. Despite his size, Jamie remained gentle and playful, always careful not to harm Mama Grace. He quickly became her greatest helper. Jamie carried heavy bundles of firewood with ease, climbed tall baobab trees to gather sweet fruits, and fetched water from the stream in a clay pot, balancing it perfectly on his head. One day, as Mama Grace worked on weaving her baskets, she looked up to see Jamie tying bundles of sticks with a rope. Her eyes sparkled with joy. Clapping her hands, she exclaimed, "Jamie, you've learned so much." Pride radiated from her face. Jamie grinned, holding up the tied bundle with shining eyes, clearly pleased with his progress. The once quiet hut now buzzed with energy and life. Jamie's playful spirit filled every corner. He loved swinging from the branches of the big tree near their home, his white fur gleaming against the green leaves. Often, he would leap down suddenly to surprise Mama Grace. She would pretend to scold him, wagging her finger, but always ended up laughing. Jamie's cleverness astounded her. It seemed he could understand not only her words, but also her emotions. When Mama Grace was tired, Jamie would sit beside her, placing his large hand gently on her shoulder, as if to say, "I am here." On days when sadness crept into her heart, Jamie would make silly faces or tug at her shawl until she smiled. To Mama Grace, Jamie was more than just an animal. He was her family, her companion, and the light that had filled her once lonely life. Their simple existence brought a happiness she hadn't felt in years. But as Jamie grew, whispers began to circulate in the nearby village. People who caught glimpses of the large white baboon started to gossip. "He's too big," some said uneasily. "No animal should grow that large." Others murmured, "It's unnatural. Maybe he's cursed." Mama Grace dismissed the rumors. She knew the truth. To her, Jamie wasn't a curse, he was a gift, her miracle, and nothing else mattered. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Mama Grace sat outside her hut, watching Jamie swing joyfully from the tree branches. His happiness lit up the twilight. "You are special, Jamie," she said softly, her voice brimming with love and pride. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Jamie's size and intelligence were nothing short of extraordinary to Mama Grace. But news of the unusual white baboon began to spread throughout the village of Willow. People whispered about Jamie's strength, his large size, and even rumors that he could understand human speech. One day, Mama Grace decided to visit the village market. She rarely left her home, but she needed supplies she couldn't gather herself. Jamie walked beside her, carrying a small basket in his strong arms. His tall figure caught everyone's attention as they entered the market. As they arrived, the cheerful buzz of the crowd faded. Villagers turned to stare, and an uneasy silence settled over the market. Mothers pulled their children close, and men exchanged nervous glances. "Is that the white baboon they've been talking about?" a woman whispered. "It's not normal," another replied, her voice shaky. Jamie noticed the fearful stares and tightened his grip on the basket, lowering his head slightly. Mama Grace gently touched his arm. "Don't worry, Jamie," she said softly. "They just don't understand you." But her comforting words couldn't stop the tension building around them. When Mama Grace approached a fruit stall, the vendor stepped back abruptly, his face pale. You can't stay here," he said, his voice trembling as his eyes darted nervously to Jamie. "That thing doesn't belong in the village." Mama Grace frowned, her voice firm as she replied, "He's not a thing. This is Jamie, and he's part of my family." The vendor shook his head, refusing to meet her gaze. Around them, the whispers grew louder. "It's a bad sign," someone murmured. "What if it hurts someone?" another added. Jamie shifted uneasily, feeling the fear and distrust radiating from the crowd. His confused eyes turned to Mama Grace, silently asking what to do. "Let's go home," Mama Grace said calmly, though there was a trace of sadness in her voice. Keeping her head high, she turned and walked away. Jamie followed closely, trying to make himself look smaller. As they left, the villagers' murmurs persisted, their whispers twisting into wild rumors. By the week's end, the stories about Jamie had become darker. Some claimed they had seen him lifting heavy logs with ease, while others swore he could speak like a human. Fear and suspicion warped the truth, and soon villagers began calling Jamie a wicked spirit or a demon in disguise. "He's too smart for an animal," an elder declared. "No creature like that should exist." When the dry season arrived, the savannah baked under the relentless sun. Mama Grace, who had always been strong despite her age, began to grow weaker. At first, it was subtle. She moved more slowly and rested more often. But soon, even simple tasks like weaving baskets or gathering firewood became too difficult for her. One morning, as Jamie carried a bundle of sticks back to their hut, Mama Grace stumbled and dropped her basket. She leaned against a tree, her breathing shallow and labored. Jamie rushed to her side, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "I am just tired, Jamie," she said softly, trying to smile through her pain. "I'll be okay." But Jamie could see the truth. Her hands, once steady and strong, now trembled, and her steps were slow and uncertain. Over the next few days, Mama Grace stayed inside the hut, too weak to go out. Jamie took over all her chores. He gathered firewood, fetched water from the stream, and even tried his hand at cooking, though his large fingers struggled with the delicate tasks. Every evening, he sat by her bedside, his worried eyes never leaving her. One night, under a sky full of stars, Mama Grace reached out and took Jamie's hand. Her touch was soft, and her skin felt cool. "You've been so good to me, Jamie," she said in a quiet voice. "I am so proud of you." Jamie tilted his head, his bright eyes searching Mama Grace's face, as if pleading for her to explain. He made a soft sound, a quiet cry for answers. "I am just getting old, my boy," she said with a gentle laugh, though it lacked strength. "My time is almost over." Jamie shook his head, refusing to accept her words. He leaned closer, pressing his forehead against her hand, his heart heavy with fear. He couldn't imagine life without her, the one person who had cared for him, who had shown him love when no one else did. The next morning, Mama Grace's condition worsened. Her breathing was shallow and her voice was barely audible. Jamie stayed by her side, holding her frail hand in his large one, as if his presence alone could keep her strong. By midday, Jamie realized he couldn't help her on his own. He needed someone who could. Rising to his full height, he looked at her one last time, concern etched in his golden eyes. She gave him a weak smile, her gaze filled with love. "Be careful, my boy," she whispered, her voice faint like the softest breeze. Without hesitation, Jamie sprinted toward the village, desperate to save the only family he had ever known. Inside the small hut, Mama Grace lay back in her bed, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. The room grew quiet, with only the soft rustle of wind slipping through the open window. Jamie ran as fast as his strong legs could carry him, his white fur gleaming in the sun, a bright flash against the golden grass. As he approached the village, the usual lively sounds of people working and laughing came to an abrupt halt. A woman carrying vegetables froze in her tracks, her eyes wide with fear. Children playing nearby dropped their sticks and dashed into their homes. "It's the white creature!" someone shouted. Jamie slowed, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. He made soft, pleading noises, trying to show he meant no harm. But all the villagers could see was his large size and unusual color. Fear twisted their hearts. "He's here to attack us!" a man yelled, grabbing a stick. More villagers emerged from their homes, clutching sticks, stones, and tools as weapons. Jamie stepped back, his hands still raised, but the crowd pressed closer, their fear transforming into anger. "Get the nets!" someone shouted. Before Jamie could react, a thick rope net was thrown over him. He struggled to break free, but more nets followed, tangling around his arms and legs. He let out a loud cry, his voice filled with pain and desperation, echoing across the village. "Don't let him escape!" another man bellowed as they tightened the ropes, forcing him to the ground. Jamie's golden eyes darted around the crowd, searching desperately for someone who might help. For a moment, the villagers hesitated. His cry wasn't the sound of a beast, it was full of pain and sorrow. But their fear quickly returned, overwhelming any flicker of empathy. They bound him tightly and dragged him to an old wooden shed at the edge of the village. Jamie stopped struggling, his body slumping in defeat. He lay still, breathing heavily, his eyes filled with sadness. They locked him inside the dark shed and hurried away, their fearful whispers fading into the distance. In the dim light of the shed, Jamie sat on the dusty floor, his strong frame slouched in despair. He thought of Mama Grace, her kind smile and soothing voice. He had come to save her, but now he was trapped, helpless to do anything. A single tear rolled down his face as he closed his eyes, overcome by the weight of his failure. Outside, the sun sank lower, bathing the village in hues of orange and red. The quiet shed stood still, holding Jamie's heartbreak, far away from the world he longed to help. At the small hut on the savannah, Mama Grace waited, her weak body trembling as each moment stretched into eternity. She gazed at the door, her heart filled with worry for Jamie. Inside the dark wooden shed, Jamie sat motionless, his large frame slumped against the rough walls. His once bright golden eyes, filled with wonder and hope, now appeared dull and lifeless, clouded by despair. The ropes binding him felt impossibly heavy, like the weight of his failure pressing down on his soul. Outside, the villagers gathered in tense clusters, their murmurs filled with fear and uncertainty. Some paced nervously, clutching sticks and tools as though preparing for an attack, while others whispered about the mysterious creature locked away in the shed. "Why did it come here?" a man asked, gripping a spear tightly. "Maybe it wanted to attack us," another man replied, his voice quivering. "No animal should look or act like that, it's unnatural." But not everyone agreed. An older woman leaned heavily on her walking stick, her brows furrowed as she spoke. "It didn't look dangerous," she said softly. "It seemed scared." Her words were quickly drowned out by louder voices filled with panic. "We can't take that chance," a younger man argued firmly. "It's too dangerous to keep it here." Inside the shed, Jamie shifted slightly, testing the ropes that bound him. They were tied tightly, and with every small movement, They dug deeper into his fur. A low, mournful sound escaped his lips as his thoughts turned to Mama Grace. She was alone, fragile, and waiting for him. He had left to save her, and now he was trapped, powerless to return. Nearby, a young boy crept cautiously toward the shed. His small, curious hands gripped the wooden walls as he peered through a narrow gap. For a moment, his wide eyes met Jamie's. The boy froze, fear gripping him until he saw the sadness in Jamie's gaze. "It's crying," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible. "What are you doing? Stay back," an adult scolded sharply, rushing forward to pull the boy away. The villagers' arguments grew louder and more heated. Some demanded Jamie be driven out, while others hesitated, unsure of what to do. Finally, the village elder, Mr. Barrow, stepped forward. His tall figure and commanding presence silenced the crowd. "Enough," he said in a steady, deep voice. "We cannot act out of fear. We need to understand why it came here." The villagers fell quiet, though their uneasy glances at the shed betrayed their lingering fear. Inside, Jamie heard their muffled voices but could not understand their words. His head lowered, his shoulders slumped, and his heart felt heavy with grief. He wasn't afraid of them, he was afraid for Mama Grace. She needed him, and he was helpless to return to her side. Back at the small hut, Mama Grace lay still on her bed. The frail rise and fall of her chest was the only movement in the room. The soft golden light of the setting sun filtered through the cracks in the wooden walls, bathing her face in a warm glow. Her breaths were shallow and labored, each one requiring more effort than the last. She turned her gaze toward the open door, whispering softly, "Come back, Jamie." But the hut remained silent, save for the soft rustling of the wind and the distant cries of the wilderness. Mama Grace closed her eyes, her body growing weaker as the sun sank lower, painting the savannah in hues of orange and gold. The golden sun rose higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the savannah as Jamie ran. His powerful legs carried him swiftly, the wind rushing past him as his heart beat with desperation. Each stride brought him closer to the little hut that had been his home, the place where Mama Grace had cared for him, loved him, and taught him the meaning of family. As he approached the familiar clearing, a strange stillness settled over the air. The usual comforting sounds of the birds and rustling leaves seemed absent, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Jamie slowed down, his chest heaving as he reached the door of the hut. Inside, the silence was deafening. The room was bathed in soft morning light, but it felt empty and cold. Jamie stepped inside cautiously, his golden eyes scanning the space. There, on the simple bed, lay Mama Grace. She looked peaceful, her face calm and serene, as though she were merely asleep. Jamie moved closer, his large frame trembling as he knelt beside her. He let out a soft, sorrowful whimper, gently touching her frail hand with his own, but her hand didn't respond. The warmth that had once comforted him was gone. A deep, mournful cry escaped Jamie's lips, echoing through the small hut and out into the vast savannah. It was a sound of pure heartbreak, a cry that carried the weight of his love, his loss, and his helplessness. For a long time, Jamie stayed by Mama Grace's side, his head resting on the edge of the bed. Memories of her kindness, her laughter, and the bond they had shared filled his mind. He thought of the day she had saved him, a tiny, frightened creature, and how she had given him a home and a family. As the sun climbed higher, its rays streamed through the cracks in the hut, lighting up the room in a golden glow. Jamie lifted his head slowly, his eyes filled with tears, but also with a quiet resolve. He knew what he had to do. Gently, with all the care he could muster, Jamie picked up Mama Grace's fragile body in his strong arms. She had given him everything, and now it was his turn to honor her. Carrying her outside, he walked toward the great baobab tree near their homia tree they had often sat under together, sharing quiet moments of peace. Under its shade, Jamie began to dig, his powerful hands working tirelessly. The villagers had always feared him for his strength, But now that same strength was being used for love and respect. When the grave was ready, Jamie laid Mama Grace to rest beneath the tree. He covered her with the earth gently, as though tucking her in one last time. Then, he placed a bundle of wildflowers he had gathered from the savannah on the fresh mound of earth. Jamie sat there for hours, watching over the spot as the sun moved across the sky. The villagers, who had followed at a distance, watched silently. Some wiped away tears, while others whispered to each other in awe. "She saved him," one elder said softly. "And now he's honoring her. Maybe we were wrong about him all along." From that day on, Jamie stayed near the great baobab tree, guarding the resting place of the one who had given him life in more ways than one. The villagers, humbled by his devotion and moved by his love, began to see him not as a monster, but as a creature capable of deep feeling and loyalty. And so, the white baboon became a legend in the savannah, a symbol of love, courage, and the unbreakable bond between two souls who had found each other in the wilderness. Even as the seasons changed and years passed, Jamie's story was told and retold, reminding everyone who heard it of the power of kindness and the beauty of love that transcends fear. Jamie's mind was filled with thoughts of Mama Grace, her warm smile and her soft, soothing voice. She needed him, and he had to reach her.